I've always had a fascination with collecting things that remind me of my childhood. I wander through yard sales or thrift stores, searching for old toys, trinkets that once belonged to someone, or souvenirs from places I visited with my parents. This hobby usually fills me with a warm sense of nostalgia, but last summer, it became the origin of something far darker. It happened at the sale of an elderly woman, tucked away in the corner of her cluttered yard. Among old baseball cards and a milk crate full of battered action figures, I found it, half hidden but unmistakable, a Furby. People always joked about how creepy they were, but to me, my Furby had been more than just a toy. It was a friend, my confidant. I spent hours with it as a child, stroking its soft fur, speaking to it, holding its black and white fuzz close. I remembered the tea parties, the games of house, and the pink one I carried everywhere, 15 years ago. The old lady didn't remember it, but she smiled and told me, "My grandkids brought so many toys over the years, I can't possibly keep track of them all." She rambled about her 2 grandsons and 3 granddaughters, how they used to visit every weekend, until they grew up and moved on with their own families. After buying it, I played with the Furby for a while, giggling at the childish gibberish it spouted. I ran my fingers through its soft fur. The white belly was dirty, and its head was missing more than a few strands of fur, but it worked. It made me happy. I placed it on a shelf in my bedroom before eating and going to bed. I was awakened in the middle of the night by a strange, hissing sound coming from the Furby. Irritated, I removed the batteries and went back to sleep. The next day, I replaced them, and it seemed fine again. But as I ran my fingers through its fur, a clump of it came off in my hand. That night, the hissing returned, louder this time. As I approached, I realized the Furby was whispering. It wasn't the usual gibberish, it was something else, something unintelligible. I told myself it was probably malfunctioning due to its age, and I removed the batteries, vowing only to power it on when I played with it. The problem seemed solved, for the moment. 3 days later, I had barely noticed the passing time. Work kept me busy, and I hadn't paid much attention to the shelf of old toys. A friend came over for dinner, and I showed her the Furby. We laughed about it, and she played with it while I cooked. But then she pointed out how worn it had become. "I know you love this thing, but wouldn't you prefer one in better shape? It's missing fur and it's dirty." I knew about the bald spot on its head, but when she turned it around and pointed to 2 dime-sized patches of bare skin on its back, I was confused. I could have sworn they hadn't been there before. I mumbled something about it being well loved, put it back on the shelf, and finished preparing dinner. After my friend left, I settled on the couch, distractedly watching TV. Then, I heard it. A thump. I muted the sound, listening carefully. Before I could dismiss it, another thump sounded, followed by a sound I couldn't quite place. Then, another giggle. I froze. The Furby. I grabbed the umbrella I kept by the door, slowly making my way toward my bedroom. My heart pounded as I wondered who, or what, was playing with it in the dark. It giggled again. I entered the room, my improvised weapon gripped tightly in my hand, ready to strike. But there was no intruder, only silence. The only sign that something was wrong was the Furby, now lying in the center of the room. My heart raced as I scanned every corner, listening for any sound that might betray the presence of someone else. There were no footsteps, no creaks of the floorboards. Just the eerie stillness. I turned to leave, intent on checking the rest of the house. Then, I heard it, the nasally voice of the toy, clear as day, whispering behind me, "Bleed." A cold shiver crawled down my spine. I turned slowly to face the Furby, my breath hitching in my throat. It had to be my imagination. But as I stared at it, its eyelids slowly closed and reopened, and it spoke again, "Die. Bleed. Die." I snatched it up, heart hammering in my chest, and practically ran to the front door, tossing it outside. As I slammed the door shut, I heard its unsettling giggle echo through the glass. I tried to focus on the TV, but the little monster on my front lawn was all I could think about. After an hour of jumping at every sound and nervously glancing at the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, sleep was impossible. My dreams were filled with tiny, fuzzy demons, clawing and scratching at me. The next morning, still trying to shake off the horrors of the night, I opened the front door. But the moment I saw my porch, my blood ran cold. The Furby sat on the front step, surrounded by blood and clumps of light brown fur. Its yellow plastic beak was lodged in a small piece of flesh, as though it had caught it mid-bite. It was nearly bald now, its fur clumped together, matted and stained. Beneath it, there was a dead rabbit, its body stripped clean, only the head remaining, its glassy eyes staring into nothingness. The tip of its tongue hung from its mouth, resting in the blood-soaked floorboards of the porch. I turned away, my stomach churning, and gagged, slamming the door shut behind me. Rushing to the bathroom, I lost my breakfast. I called in sick, my mind racing. What could I do? I couldn't tell anyone, they'd think I was losing my mind. The police? They'd probably lock me away for good. I was on my own. After a moment of cold, brutal clarity, I grabbed a couple of garbage bags and some cleaning supplies. I had to get rid of the evidence. The first thing I did was bag up the Furby, sealing it tight, and threw it in the trash can at the curb. Tomorrow, the garbage men would take it away. And for the first time in days, I felt a little lighter. The rest of the day passed without incident, and by the time I went to bed, the horrors of the morning seemed like a fading nightmare. Then, just after falling asleep, I was jolted awake by an ear-piercing shriek, unnatural and raw, vibrating through the walls. I scanned the room, frantic, trying to place the sound. Then, something slammed against my door with such force that a picture fell from the wall beside it. The wailing continued, piercing through the silence of the house. Trembling, I grabbed my phone, dialing 911, my hand shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I screamed in terror as another slam hit the door, the wood cracking, the sound echoing through the house. The door was splintering, the frame threatening to give way. And then, silence. The operator stayed on the line as I huddled in the corner, paralyzed with fear. When the police arrived, they found the front door and windows still locked, untouched. After a thorough search, they found nothing. They took my statement, reassured me it was likely just a prank, and told me to call if anything else happened. But I knew. I knew it wasn't over. I couldn't sleep that night, no matter how hard I tried. I grabbed a blanket from my bed and decided to camp out on the couch, hoping to drown out the creeping fear with a movie. I flicked the light on in my bedroom and froze. There, sitting perfectly still on my bed, was the Furby. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, waiting. Watching. There was barely any fur left on the Furby now. Its once brown eyes had transformed into blood-red orbs, cold and empty, like frozen ice. I slammed the door shut, but the thing outside was relentless. It began howling, its voice twisted and guttural, shrieking the words "bleed and die" over and over. It hurled itself at the door with such force that the wood splintered along the crack it had made earlier. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the house, the cold night air biting at my skin. In my panic, I'd left my phone and wallet behind, so I decided to drive around, trying to shake off the terror until I could find someone to help. I drove aimlessly, exhaustion creeping in, until my eyelids grew heavy. I pulled over to rest, desperate for a moment of peace. It wasn't until I looked around, checking to make sure I was alone, that I realized where I had stopped. I was right in front of the old lady's house, the one who had sold me the Furby. I hesitated, my mind torn. After a long inner battle, I decided to talk to her in the morning. The thought of confronting her, of confronting the nightmare I'd bought from her, left me feeling uneasy. As I closed my eyes, I tried to ignore the unsettling discomfort of trying to sleep in the front seat of my car. I thought of how to approach her, to get the information I needed without sounding completely insane. Before I knew it, I opened my eyes. The bright sunlight pierced through the windows, and I groggily checked the rearview mirror, stretching my arms and legs. I walked up the short sidewalk to the front door, still unsure what I'd even say to her. I reached the screen door, surprised when the inner door swung open just a little. I hesitated, called out a greeting, and pushed the door open further. What I found inside stopped me dead in my tracks. The smell hit me first, a rancid, suffocating stench that made my stomach churn. The old lady, the one who had sold me the cursed thing, was lying motionless in the center of the living room floor. Her once brown eyes were pale and glazed, her sagging skin turning an unnatural gray. I froze, unable to look away, as a large orange cat hissed and scurried away from the body, leaving behind a gaping wound in the old woman's cheek, where the flesh had been torn away. Through the hole, I could see the jagged edges of teeth and gums. The cat's eyes glowed for a moment before it fled into the house, leaving me alone with the nightmare I had stumbled into. I stumbled back outside, my head spinning, and barely made it to the bushes before throwing up. I had to get help. I knocked on a neighbor's door, explaining what I had found and asking for assistance. The police arrived shortly after, and I spent hours trying to explain the horror I had just witnessed, but I couldn't tell them about the Furby. I couldn't let anyone know the truth. I told them I just wanted to buy a few leftover toys, that I had come by to see if she had anything left from her yard sale. They didn't seem convinced, but eventually they let me go. I climbed into my car, unsure where to go. I drove aimlessly for miles, my thoughts a whirlwind. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound coming from the back seat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my blood turned cold. There it was. The Furby. Sitting innocently against the passenger side door, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. My foot slammed the brake, and I scrambled out of the car in a panic, my heart racing as the laughter from the back seat grew louder, more menacing. It was no longer the slow, childish giggle. Now, it was a deep, malicious cackle, clear and hollow, void of any innocence. The voice had changed, no longer nasally, but guttural, as though the thing was savoring my fear. I was done. I couldn't take it anymore. I got back in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. The laughter and whispers, bleed, followed me all the way home, growing louder with every mile. I parked in the driveway, my mind made up. I grabbed the Furby by its ear, the one that hadn't fallen off yet, and dragged it to the backyard. Without hesitation, I tossed it into the charcoal grill, drenched it in lighter fluid, and set it ablaze. The flames roared to life as I watched the remaining fur and cloth burn away, the plastic beginning to melt, the thing's agonizing scream growing louder and more distorted as it was reduced to a pile of blackened goo. Its voice twisted, deeper, rasping in pain as the fire consumed it. The flames turned from a bright red-orange to a sickly green. The smoke grew thick and black, curling into the air. And then, with a deafening bang, the fire seemed to explode, the sound like a gunshot that rang in my ears. The flames died down quickly, the smoke clearing. I stood there, watching the grill, feeling a sense of relief. It was finally over. But when I looked inside, the grill was empty.